So it's a weekend and you are looking through your phone, probably scrolling through social media, and you're just thinking, wow, that person seems like they have such a good life, and you're wondering whether you have a good life. Indeed, the good life is something that I'd say most of us, if not all of us, are after. It is an aspiration that we all share. But how exactly can we get a good life? This is actually a question of the ages. Philosophers have been thinking about it for a very long time, trying to crack the code of a good life. And today, over this weekend, I think we can talk a bit about it and hopefully bring some clarity to it. We begin firstly with the ancient Greeks. To the ancient Greeks, again, ancient Greece being the birthplace of philosophy as we know it, really. There has always been this idea of eudaimonia, which is what they mean, I suppose, by a good life. But that was really about feeling good or being in good spirit. And so philosophers from those periods have been trying to look at how we can actually achieve eudaimonia. And there's no one better to start with than with Socrates. Socrates would ask you, when you say you want to have a good life, what exactly do you mean by a good life? What do you mean by good? Do you mean pleasure or do you mean virtue? Do you mean having a good time or doing good things? Now, this might sound like a very strange and quaint distinction, but take for a moment to consider two people. You could have one person who is living a virtuous life, literally doing good things in his life by some moral standard, having a very good life in that sense. You could, of course, say that he is having a good life because, again, he is doing good things. On the other hand, you could also have a person who is literally living in a very pleasurable way. He is engaging in his sensual pleasures all the time. He is feeling good. You could, of course, say because of how he's living, how he's feeling, he is also having a good life. So again, that is a distinction. Who is truly having a good life? The person who is being virtuous or the person who is engaging in all of his pleasures? That is a distinction that is very hard for us to set. Again, both instances we would say they are having a good life. And indeed, in philosophy, those are very two different camps. You have, on the one hand, Epicurus, who I've talked about in one of my previous videos, where his idea of having a good life is actually really for us to pursue pleasure and avoid pain. But of course, pleasure could be sensual pleasures, intellectual pleasures. As long as we're pursuing pleasure, that is nature's way of telling us, through us feeling good, that we are having a good life. And that is really how we could have a good life. In contrast to Epicurus, you have Diogenes, who believed that when you try to pursue pleasure, it is very ephemeral because the sun does not always shine. There will be, of course, rainy days too. And because of its chaotic nature, there's really no joy in pursuing pleasure alone. Rather, for us to have a good life, a sense where we become in good spirit, we should instead live with certain codes and live almost a Spartan life, perhaps in harmony with nature, with certain principles in life, and really pursue a life that is good, rather than a life where you feel good only as your ultimate pursuit. And so these two philosophers represent two very different camps about what do we mean by having a good life, as we question along in the Socratic sort of tradition what a good life means. Of course, this sounds at the moment quite quaint, and I admit that, because most of us, when at least originally were looking at this question, we might think, look, Melvin, we're just talking about how do I feel good about my life, feeling good. But again, what it highlights is that living a good life is not necessarily always and inevitably about feeling good. And of course, when you look at Diogenes' views, that's certainly that sort of conclusion you get. Maybe it is about being more virtuous. And indeed, if you were to look at other philosophers, they would show you that. The common idea that a good life means having a good time is also questioned by, for example, Arthur Schopenhauer, who is famously quite pessimistic about this entire pursuit of desires and pleasures. For Schopenhauer, Diogenes would only be half right. Yes, indeed, with Diogenes, you can't always achieve your desires and your pleasures. There are not only sunny days, there are also rainy days. But for Schopenhauer, there's also this bigger aspect that usually when you finally achieve your desire, or you finally gratify yourself and you indulge in that pleasure, usually it doesn't feel as good as you thought it would. And also, if it does, it usually does not last. Eventually, you will start to itch for the next thing. So for Schopenhauer, such pursuits will always end in disappointments for all of us. And that by going along this path, we are more or less doomed to a failure of always disappointing ourselves as we're pursuing the next pleasure, and so on and so forth. So Schopenhauer has quite a disdain for desire in that sense, or feeling good as a means of having a good life. But interestingly, we can also move east and look at the thoughts of Siddhartha Gautama, who is famously known as being the Buddha. Well, according to his legend, as we know, at least according to the Buddhist text and tradition, he was once born a prince, and he has actually engaged in life of being a prince and all sorts of sensual pleasures. But ultimately, that did not bring him ultimate happiness. He also went to the extreme of being an ascetic, literally suffering in a physical and spiritual way, to try and see whether that would get him any real sense of pleasure. And also, he did not find it. Ultimately, in his teaching, at least according to the story of the Buddha and also Buddhist tradition, it is not so much about avoiding sensual pleasures and denying their existence. At the same time, it is not about indulging it. The Buddha talks about a middle way of at least acknowledging that these pleasures, these desires, a feeling good exists for all of us, but at the same time, learning to overcome it and live in an enlightened way, at least through the Buddhist teaching. And that is a very interesting thought. It is sort of acknowledging the two camps that we've talked about so far. And indeed, his views would be, I would say, would be supported by Aristotle, who would also argue that we should focus on achieving the golden mean, which is an ideal balance. Not too much excess, yet also not too much restraint. And that is really the way for us to have a good life, according to this Aristotelian view of the golden mean, where we are, again, not indulging too much in pleasure, but yes, we are also acknowledging and practicing the pursuit of certain desires and gratification, but at the same time also realizing that there needs to be a pursuit of much more than pleasure, of a higher, perhaps greater code of virtue. So long story short, you might think, Melvin, so essentially what you're saying is we have to be balanced. It isn't just about having a good time, it is also about living much more than just feeling good, but also doing good things with your life. Well, I'll end with this. If you look at the work of the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, he would actually move this entire argument away from just about feeling good or about virtue. For him, really, achieving that sense of goodness is more about realizing human potential. And what it means is, for example, you could, of course, set a target to scale a mountain and get to the top of the mountain. And you could, of course, have a good time. You could pay for some luxury helicopter ride to go up there, and then finally you're there within 20 minutes and you can take a selfie, put it on Instagram, and of course then that would be that. And you could say you can live along this and perpetuate this sort of social media image of having a good life, but truly you wouldn't feel good. You could of course also say you want to avoid all that altogether and perhaps study about mountains and be this great geologist and again follow the totally different camp of virtue and codes, and you could say you have a good life. But for him, the greatest thing really is when we go through the experience of living and go through the journey of living and its challenges and realizing our potential. So for him, it is about actually scaling the mountain and not taking the helicopter because of the challenges you go through. And by the experience of going through all that, when you finally reach the peak, you just feel amazing. And this is such an achievement to you. You could have taken the shortcut, but of course, by doing that, you've actually achieved a sense of greatness. And so for Nietzsche, the point about having a good life is actually realizing your potential by going through challenges and seeing what you're capable of. It isn't so much about whether you feel good or following a certain code. It is about realizing who you are and what you're capable of. And that's what Nietzsche would say is really the point of good life. So as we are sitting here this weekend thinking about whether our lives are good and whether we're having a good time, these are some things we can think about.